What exactly is so scary about African spirituality?
Whenever we speak about African mythology and spirituality, which is
All the time.
we often notice a pattern. Some people say things like,
It's safer to read about these stories from other countries.
African spirituality is too scary, too real to talk about.
This raises a bigger question. Why do people fear our own myths and deities while engaging freely with others?
Let's unpack this together and dispel some very dangerous misconceptions.
First things first, let's talk definitions. Oxford Dictionary refers to spirituality as people's subjective practice and experience of their religion, or to the spiritual exercises and beliefs which individuals or groups have with regard to their personal relationship with God. Mythology as the study of religious or heroic legends and tales that seem incredible and which were created by particular communities as myths. And religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things.
These concepts often overlap, but it's crucial to acknowledge a terminological problem when discussing African religions. The word religion is deeply tied to Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which influences and limits our understanding of African spiritual ideas and beliefs.
Western academics, theologians, and missionaries shape the descriptions of African belief systems based on their own religious perspective, which often led to misconceptions. As the late Kenyan academic John Mbiti wrote, these earlier descriptions left us with terms which are inadequate, derogatory, and prejudicial. One key example is E.B. Taylor's concept of animism in his 1871 book, Primitive Culture.
He claimed that so-called primitive people believed every object had its own soul, leading to a form of polytheism he placed at the bottom of religious evolution. This view distorted African spiritual systems, reducing them to a simplistic belief in spirits rather than recognizing their complex philosophical, ethical, and cosmological dimensions.
These colonial interpretations still influence how African spirituality is perceived today, framing it as dangerous or backwards, but in reality, African spiritual traditions are as diverse, sophisticated, and ancient as any other global belief system, often predating and influencing modern religions.
Let's talk about the F word, fear.
Someone once commented, it's safer to read about these stories from other countries as it's not real to us, they are less scary.
In many cultures, deities and spirits hold power, and power can be intimidating. The ancient Greeks feared Zeus' wrath. Norse mythology speaks of Ragnarok, the end of days, where the gods themselves fall in battle. The Bible contains stories of divine punishment, from the Great Flood wiping out humanity to the 10 plagues of Egypt.
Yet we don't hear people saying Greek mythology is too scary to engage with, nor do we hear that the Bible is too dangerous to learn. Do these stories have elements that can enact fear? Yeah. Do people stop learning about them or engaging in TV shows, movies, and books inspired by them because of it?
No. So, why does African spirituality get singled out as uniquely terrifying?
One factor could be that African spirituality is still deeply intertwined with daily life in many communities. Unlike Greek or Norse mythology, which are largely viewed by some as historical traditions, African spiritual systems for the most part remain actively practiced and venerated across the continent. This makes African spirituality feel more real in a way that mythology from other cultures does not. But that does not mean it should be considered as scary. It does not mean we should avoid it altogether.
As H.P. Lovecraft said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. We fear what we do not know. When something is not easily understood, it can easily be dismissed as scary or dangerous. Colonial narratives also played a key role in shaping this fear. European colonial powers deliberately framed African deities and spirits as malevolent forces in order to justify the suppression of indigenous religions. Missionary accounts frequently describe African spiritual practices as witchcraft or devil worship, further embedding this idea that traditions were inherently dangerous. This framing persists today, influencing the way African spirituality is viewed, both within and outside the continent.
Finally, popular culture has reinforced these misconceptions. Hollywood films, literature, and media often portray African spirituality through a lens of horror. Think of how voodoo is commonly depicted as dark magic, rather than a legitimate spiritual tradition that inspired the revolution against Haiti's French colonizers more than 200 years ago. This established Haiti as the second independent nation in the Americas and the first to abolish slavery. The reality is that African spirituality, like all religious and mythological systems, has elements that can be interpreted as both awe-inspiring and intimidating. However, the continued framing of it as uniquely fearsome is a product of historical bias, not an inherent truth. It is time to critically examine where these fears come from and reclaim an authentic understanding of our spiritual heritage.
We can't ignore colonialism wisdom when discussing how African spirituality is perceived today.
Missionaries demonized traditional beliefs, indigenous spiritual practices were labeled as savage and demonic.
Laws were passed against indigenous religions. In places like Nigeria, the British colonial government outlawed practices like ether divination and traditional shrines.
Generations were conditioned to reject their own heritage. Schools and churches placed indigenous knowledge with European interpretations of spirituality.
Despite these efforts, African spirituality persisted. Many traditions went underground, continuing in secrecy to avoid persecution. In regions like Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil, enslaved Africans preserved their spiritual systems by syncretizing them with Catholicism, leading to the emergence of faiths like Voodoo, Santeria, and Candomblé.
And even within Africa, traditional practices remained resilient. Original worship, ancestral veneration, and healing rituals adapted and thrived in rural communities, passed down orally through generations. Despite centuries of suppression, these spiritual systems remain deeply embedded in cultural identity and continue to influence contemporary African societies.
Now, to be clear, Christianity existed in Africa before colonialism. Ethiopia, for instance, adopted Christianity in the 4th century through the Kingdom of Aksum. But that form of Christianity, rooted in Ethiopian traditions, is distinct from the European versions forced upon much of the continent during the colonial rule.
And it does not erase the fact that countless other spiritual systems existed in Africa before colonialism, including the worship of Odun in West Africa, Orisha traditions among the Yoruba, and the Kemetic spirituality of ancient Egypt.
Some argue that we should put colonialism aside and examine African spirituality through a different lens.
But here's the problem. You can't discuss the modern perception of African spirituality without acknowledging how colonialism reshaped it.
Colonial powers intentionally demonized indigenous beliefs to justify conversion and control. The idea that African spirituality is inherently dangerous or primitive is a direct result of that erasure.
So instead of pretending colonialism doesn't matter, we need to confront how it shaped and continues to shape the way we see our own traditions.
Now, let's talk about why this matters today.
There is a huge double standard when it comes to how some people discuss African traditional religions versus major world religions.
Trigger warning for mentions of sacrifice, violence, and divine punishment.
Some people say African mythology is demonic and African traditions practice human sacrifice.
But Christianity, Islam, and Judaism also contain stories of divine punishment, massacres, and even child sacrifice.
Let's get into it. Abraham was tested by God to sacrifice his son Isaac.
Jephthah sacrificed his daughter to fulfill a vow to God.
The biblical flood wiped out humanity except for Noah and his family.
Yet, no one argues that Christianity or Judaism should be reduced to just these stories.
But when it comes to African spirituality, people immediately highlight only the aspects they find unsettling. Why is that? Why do we accept the complexities of other faiths, yet strip African traditions down to fear and superstition?
Every spiritual system has uncomfortable histories, but those histories do not define an entire belief system. Just to be clear, we do not condone these acts, nor do we believe they're acceptable. However, it's important to recognize the selective framing and acknowledge the broader cultural and historical context.
Our folklore, our spirituality, our stories, these are parts of our identity.
Studying them doesn't mean you have to worship them.
You read about Greek mythology without believing in Zeus.
And you watch shows inspired by Norse legends without feeling compelled to worship Thor.
In school, we study a range of active religions from Christianity and Islam to Sikhism and Judaism.
So, there's no reason to not educate ourselves on the vast range of African pantheons without fear.
It's time to move past the framing of African spirituality, mythology, and folklore as scary.
These are our stories, our history, our culture.
And they deserve the same respect and nuance as any other mythology or religion.
If you ever felt hesitant to learn about African mythology or spirituality, ask yourself,
where did that fear come from?
Was it your own or was it taught to you?
Let's reclaim our narratives.
And if you're ready to dive deeper into African folklore, history, and spirituality,
Stick with us. Like, comment, and subscribe, and let's keep the conversation going.